Hey folks, so a lot of you are having problems with your Chrysler Grand Voyager and the cold start problem. Now it's appearing on a lot of the forums and information channels at the moment. The typical thing especially in the UK, is the 2.8 and the 2.5 CRD model, that's the diesel edition, having cutouts, either difficulty starting, cutting out whilst it's idling, and the worst one, which is it's cutting out whilst you're driving. Typically it's around about 2,500 RPM, that kind of thing. Now it's something that I have had with my 2005 2.8 CRD, and I'm going to go through some of the things that I've done, and it does seem to have resolved it for me. Now, it's not going to be a simple one fix, and I think that's the problem that most of us are finding with this. So this is probably going to be a long video, so what I'll do is I'll put some markers in so you know where to skip to try different things as you work through it. So I think what we'll do is I'll show you what mine is doing now, because it's doing cold start runs and that sort of thing, and we'll go from there. So here we go, this is cold starting. So first turnover. Now the thing to remember as well is the indicator for the glow plug light goes out pretty quick on this car, but the glow plugs are still receiving power. So in cold mornings, do leave it sat that little bit longer whilst you're waiting for the glow plugs to help warm the fuel up. Now also what you can hear in the background is the fuel pump. This is the primer pump on this car. I'll turn the ignition off and back on, and you should hear it if I'm quiet. And we'll go for a start. Does that for about a minute and then settles. However, you can see the rev counter isn't seeking, and I'll show you an example of the cutouts and what it looks like when it is seeking and having problems. Now, you'll notice that this has been posted up to Patreon and not YouTube this time round. Now, I will be posting my videos to YouTube still, but I'm trying to build up Patreon now, because after YouTube decided to demonetize all of my videos because I don't have enough subscribers to my channel, and it didn't generate me very much money, but it used to generate a little amount which used to pay towards things like fuel filters, replacement parts, that kind of thing for the cars, which did help me make the videos and gave me a bit of motivation to do it. So that's why I'm going to post a Patreon. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a paid only subscribers channel. That isn't what I'm going to do. But if you do and you have a little bit of money and you want to say a thank you, please do subscribe and put a little donation amount in there. It would really be appreciated. So that's what we're going to do from now on. So I hope you join me and you stay with me on the channel through Patreon. So here we are. Here's my 2.8 CRD 2005 edition Chrysler Grand Voyager. I've taken the engine plastic cover off so we can take a look. So the first thing that we're going to look at is battery and charging. Now in the cold weather, I'm tending to put the battery on charge once a week, make sure it's topped up, because these Chryslers do take a lot out of the battery, so it's always a good idea keep that battery well topped up. And when you buy a battery, in my case, you can see what I got mine from taylor.co.uk, and the one I went for, it's 096R. The camera's not going to focus very well. There we go. 096R, and it has a 690 CCA. Now 690 CCA is okay, but the higher CCA, which is the crank current in amps, the better. The next thing to consider on diesels, especially for cold start, are the glow plugs. Now I did a video, I'll link it, replacing the glow plugs on your diesel Grand Voyager. The glow plugs are located along the front of the engine here, and there's 4 of them. The 4th one is tricky to get at. You can just see the connector behind the alternator here, but it is doable with a few angle sockets, and you can do it like that. Now if you want to see that there, that's one of the glow plugs that I removed from it. You can see the sort of scorching burning. Now it's not necessarily showing that they were particularly bad or in a poor state, but it's probably worth doing. My car's at 130,000 now, and I don't believe they were changed since new, so it's an item that relatively inexpensive you can replace. However, these are the ones that I got. They're just generic OEM style replacement. I got them from Regent Motors in Oldham. However, it is suggested to go for a slightly better one, perhaps a brand. The ones that I took out were Bosch, and it might be worth replacing those at some point with genuine Bosch glow plugs, which would help the initial cold start. So that may also be something worth doing. Now the next thing that I've done that does seem to make quite an impact is changing where I buy my fuel from. I always used to buy the fuel from the supermarkets, Asda and Tesco primarily here in the UK, and it is posted quite a lot on forums that these are a biodiesel mix, and they're not as good for the diesel engines. Now this is quite a difficult topic to go into because there's a lot of hearsay, and I can't conclusively tell you that that's what has been the problems with mine. However, since moving to using one of the larger chains, BP, Shell, some of the larger ones, and I've started to use the Optimax, the enhanced diesel, which it's a few pence more, but it does seem to have made quite a difference to my car's idling, and also the smoke that gets kicked out when I accelerate hard. It seems to have really reduced that. Now on top of that, since I had the problems, I've also used things like this diesel injector cleaner. Now again, this is a really contentious topic. A lot of people say it's snake oil and it does nothing. Perhaps, I don't know. All I know is this is what I've done, and it seems to have solved the problem for me. So for the sake of a few quid, which these ones I picked up a 2-pack for £5 in Asda, and you just put it into a full tank of fuel, let it run through, and it does seem to have made a difference to me. Let me know what you think. Put it in the comments if you've tried it, you think it works, or you think it's a load of nonsense. I'd love to know. Unfortunately, there isn't really a scientific way of working that out, so it's really just hearsay and what people think. So that's something else that I've tried, might work for you as well. So next is the crank position sensor. Now, the theory behind this one is that it uses a magnetic inductance to tell the ECU the speed of the rotating crankshaft. Now, my thinking behind this is that if that sensor is faulty or sends erratic readings back to the ECU, then it may not know the speed of the engine and cause it to stall out. So again, a reasonably cheap part. This one is a genuine VM part that I ordered from eBay, and this is something that I replaced fairly early on. It didn't directly solve the problem, so straight after changing it there was no difference. However, it is another sensor that could be changeable. Now, it's a very simple, it's only held in with a single bolt. However, getting at it is a little bit tricky. It is on the rear bottom part of the engine, so to get at it, I found it easiest to jack the passenger side of the car up on axle stands and then crawl underneath, and you can reach up to it. It uses one of the standard star hex type bolt heads, and you can change it relatively easily. Just undo the single bolt, take the connector off, and out it comes. So again, it may not solve the problem, but it's another sensor that might be worth looking into. Okay, so the fuel filter and the fuel filter assembly. Now, on this edition, this one has the fuel filter, the primer electric pump, and the filter all located underneath the car beside the fuel tank. So the first thing to check is in your engine bay, look for the can fuel filter type. Now, if your car has this, it will be sat on the left hand side and it will have a primer rubber pump on the top of it. Now you can see we don't have that on this car, so that shows that it is at the rear underneath. So if we now go down to the car, we go underneath. To give you an idea, there's the exhaust, and if we go to the right of the exhaust, coming from the driver's side, you can see that is the base of the fuel filter and pump assembly. So got the drain and the water drain there, the plastic assembly which is attached onto that nut. I would recommend not to use that nut to try and take the filter apart, as it is a very tough fitting because it's got an O-ring around it, and what you're better off doing is using something like a oil filter removal tool, which I'll show you in just a moment how I did that. What you can also find is the connectors and the wiring, which I'll show you a few photos that I've got of it there. So that's what we're looking at. Now, this also contains the fuel heater, which we'll come on to in a moment, but we'll cover the fuel filter itself. So the next thing is the fuel filter change itself. I've got a few stills here that show you how I did the fuel filter change. There is also a full video on changing the fuel filter, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning, just change it. Again, it's not a high cost item, and if you're having cutting out problems, this would be the first thing to do, because when you change the fuel filter, there's several things you can check for. When you unscrew the fuel filter, you'll find the O-ring, a rubber O-ring that helps secure the housing and the cap that holds the filter in place. Now, if this is cracked, damaged, or in some cases people have found two on there, generally from a previous service where the O-ring was mistaken or not noticed that it was on, that could cause air to get sucked into the fuel line or to cause small drawback or drain back of the system, and obviously that would cause you problems. Now, it's difficult to tell how if you're getting air sucked into the fuel lines, because
it would be difficult to do because you'd have to cut into the fuel lines and observe things like that. So it is quite difficult. So this is an easy check that you can make sure that the O-ring is in place. When you get a new fuel filter, it comes with an O-ring. Change it regardless. You might as well whilst you're there. This also comes onto the fuel filter housing itself. Now it's primarily made of plastic, as you can see, the base especially, and it is possible that it will crack. Now this can especially take place near the top, which is where the fuel heater is. And that, when it heats up and it cracks, it can cause air to be drawn in whilst fueling the car. And again, air in the fuel line will cause cutouts and spluttering. It's also been noticed that there's a membrane inside the fuel filter housing that can become damaged over time as well. Again, that can't be checked without intrusive work, so there is the potential for changing the entire fuel pump and filter assembly. Now that's not something that I've tackled. It will be involved because it involves taking all of the assembly that you can see off and out, and that may be something that we cover in a future video. Now, as you can see on this previous fuel filter change that I've done, in the bottom of the housing, in the piece that you unscrew, there was quite a lot of what looks like muddy puddle water. Now this, I suspect, is rubbish coming off the poor quality diesel fuels, as I mentioned earlier. So again, this does add to the argument to use decent fuel in your system. Now it's probably not enough to cause the entire problem, but all of these things add up, and as you can see, it's worth changing. So this leads us on to the fuel heater. Now diesels have a small fuel heater built in, and this is pretty much on every diesel model that you find out there, so it's not just restricted to Chryslers. And in the Chrysler, it is built into the rear fuel filter housing. So we'll look at the connectors and the wiring that's into the unit, and you can see that we have 3 connector blocks that go into this housing. Now the one at the very bottom is the water in fuel sensor check. Now on your dashboard you do have a little symbol that will come up if it detects that water is in your fuel, and that's the bottom sensor here. So we can take that one off, and the second connector is for the fuel pump itself and runs when you first turn the ignition on, as we heard earlier in the video, and will prime the system with diesel. This is to feed the high pressure pump in the engine compartment and to make sure that the fuel lines are all pressurized up. This fuel pump cuts out and doesn't run again whilst the engine is running. So that's the other connector. The third connector, which is the one we're interested in, is for the heater. Now the fuel heater is provided with power all the time that the car ignition is on, regardless of whether the engine is running or not. Now in the fuse box, it is a 20 amp fuse. However, on testing, this appears to be lower than 10 amps in most cases. I'll show you through what I've had to do on mine to resolve an issue with it in just a moment. So on mine, I had a problem with this. So first of all, you should have a 20 amp fuse in the fuse box and a relay below it. Now in mine, the fuse and the relay were both missing, and so once I replaced the fuse and the relay, turned the ignition on, and the fuse immediately blew. Now this suggested to me there was a problem with that circuit in some way, so the next steps were to find out why. My suspicion was it was shorting directly across the battery, causing the fuse to blow. So to test that out, taking the battery completely off and testing the fuse. The fuse should go, one side of the fuse should go straight to the battery, and the other side would then go to the relay and then to the fuel heater itself. Now mine was actually going straight to ground and positive, so it was causing a short. So to resolve the wiring problem, I had to cut back on the carpet
at the back of my Voyager, just behind the centre console, and as you can see I fitted a small wire and a fuse holder. So in this I've got a 10 amp fuse, so this is the equivalent of what you should have in your fuse box in the front of the car. And I'm going to show you how to test to make sure that your fuel heater is doing its job and is actually drawing power from the battery whilst the ignition is on. So to take the current reading, what you do is, we've got the fuse removed, and you take your meter probes and you push one into one side, and you take the other and push the other into the other side. Okay, so here we can see the digital multimeter, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect across and we'll see how much current is drawn. Five amps, 4, 3, 2 and 1 amp, and it settles around about 1.5, 1.6 amps. We can see it does start to drop increasingly because it will actually vary depending on how warm it gets the fuel to. So it's almost self-regulating. You can see it's dropping the current, but we can see a value, which is the important part of this test, that we are getting current being drawn. The other thing I changed was the TC Sensor. Now this is the manifold air pressure, which is used for the turbo boost, and also the temperature sensor. Now on this, it's very easy to get at. It's at the front here, this Bosch sensor. So you can see it's got 4 wires into it, and if we look at the circuit diagram for it, we can see very clearly how that connects and how that works. Also the overall diagram on where it's located. So as you can see, it's a 4-wire sensor, and this gives this is a combined sensor on this car. It's separate on others. So this one, it gives data to the ECU for the current temperature of the manifold and also the pressure built up in there. So it's a very important sensor. Again, this was my thinking, that it's temperature related, because it's always when the car is cold or when the outside temperature is cold that it has problems. So I looked into this temperature sensor. So removing it, again, very simple. Undo the connector block, undo the hex bolt, and it just slides straight out. Now to give you an example of the one that I took out, I have kept it, and if I show you what it looks like, so this is the one that I removed, and as you can see, it's coked up. Now that is because the EGR, exhaust gas recirculation, on diesels, which are for emission control, force the exhaust gases back into the intake. So that's what these pipes here are for, and these feed straight back in. So what that's doing is that's sending all of the diesel particulates from the exhaust back into the manifold, and obviously that is a potential why that sensor is getting so clogged up. So the fuel pressure relief valve is another one to check for. Now on these cars, it uses a diesel injector, so we've got 4 diesel injectors, and they're provided by high pressure fuel lines, but there is a return line as well, and this is the common rail that supplies the high pressure. Now on the end of this we have a pressure relief valve, and that's this valve here. Now that valve drains using this little flexible hose here, and that returns diesel to the tank. So when the pressure relief valve reaches its high pressure, it will release the overflow through that pipe. Now in some cases, when that valve starts to fail or leak, what you get is some fuel leak return, and the trouble is that reduces the overall pressure of the high pressure rail. So what we can do is, it's a very simple test, this one, that we can find out. So the hard part is, as you can see, part of this, which is the main wiring loom, gets in the way. So we'll just move that a little bit, and you can now see the flexible pipe. Now this pipe is just pushed on, so gently twisting and pulling at it, and this pipe will come off. Now whilst you're doing this, bear in mind that you will get a little bit of fuel leakage, so it's a good idea to have a cloth ready to mop up any diesel that comes off. So we take this pipe off. You can see it takes a little bit of force, but there it goes. And what we can do now is, I'm using just a plastic bottle. We put a small piece of flexible pipe on the end, like so, and feed that into our bottle, like this. And now what we can do is we can go and crank the engine, start it, and we'll see if we get any fuel leaking back into here. Basically, if you're getting fuel filling that up, then it shows that the return valve is leaking and reducing the pressure of the rail, which could cause you problems as well. So you can see I've got the bottle rested and the pipe running out. Now one thing as well, you need to just cap this off, so you can either bend it, but be careful because it can go brittle. But what I'm going to do, hopefully you'll be able to see this, is just a small screw. Just put that in the end, screw it in gently, be very careful not to damage the pipe, and that will just cap it off and make sure that you don't get any diesel floating around. So what we'll do is I'll go and crank the engine over now, and we'll take a look at what we get. And after running it for a couple of minutes, we can take a look, and there's not a thing in this bottle. So you can see that the pressure relief valve on this car is working fine. Don't forget, push the pipe back on nice and tightly, make sure it's on there, and I would turn it over and just make sure that it's not leaking after you've done this test. But that's another simple test. A further test that you can do very similar to that is to look at the amount of diesel being returned by the return on all four of your injectors. Now on this it's quite difficult because, as you can see, it uses T-pieces. So what you have to do is you have to block off one side of the T-piece, put on a flexible pipe into a plastic bottle similar to what I've done. So you've then got 4 plastic bottles that will fill up with the return diesel. Now bear in mind, there will be diesel returned this time regardless of what state they're in, so you will need to make sure that you are collecting diesel when you do this. And the idea is to compare them to see if it's a similar amount returned by each of the injectors. If one injector returns a much larger amount of diesel, it could point to that injector having a problem and needing replaced. This isn't an exact science though. I've done this on mine, I've tested all 4, and they all return a small amount, but all about the same. So I don't believe there's a major injector fault. Again, it's not 100% this test. There may still be a problem with an injector that's just not coming out quite as much as that. One further area that has a potential on this issue is the high pressure fuel pump. Now the high pressure fuel pump is located down here. It's difficult to get to, and it's not driven off the auxiliary belt, it's driven off the timing belt, so it's behind this casing here. But what we can see down here, this is the high pressure solenoid, or the connector for the high pressure solenoid, and this switches on and off with the ignition. Now it does something called PWM, pulse width modulation, so it's not a simple on-off signal. It will turn on and off very, very rapidly to vary the amount of fuel that the high pressure pump is supplying to the rail. So again, check the connector, check the obvious things. This solenoid is replaceable. You can replace it by taking the connector out here, and of course the high pressure pump is replaceable as well. However, in this case I haven't gone quite that far into it. I believe that the issues were elsewhere. And that pretty much concludes my roundup on what I've done and how mine is now running. I do believe that the temperature and the boost sensor was the key to my problems. After changing that seemed to make the biggest difference. However, all of the factors that I've gone over in this video, I believe, do have relevance and is worth working your way through, keeping a note of what you've done, what you've found out, and of course to post back comments and let people know in the forums and the various parts for it. So I really hope that this has been of use to you, and I hope that you find what the problem is with your particular Grand Voyager and it continues to operate even in the cold and the snowy weather, which, as you can see, we still have here, and it's just starting to snow again. So good luck with that, and do please comment and distribute this video. I would love to see you on the next video as well.